The media punishes democracy. Yes, really. News agencies punish democratic nations for a very simple and practical reason. It's one that I have not yet addressed on this show. And it's time to today because of something going on in a place that gets virtually no news attention. It's a huge story that is reshaping global dynamics that could affect the world for decades to come. But big legacy media organizations are giving it no attention. Coming up, I'll explain why. Plus, last week I discussed grandstanding, in which members of the media claim to care oh so much about democracy and the importance of truth telling. Well, today I'll explain how the most venerated news program in the country just devoted a segment to its own act of grandstanding. This show got a ton of praise from fellow journalists and other news agencies, of course. But in reality, this segment should be studied as a historic sign of hypocrisy in the news media and how far the media has fallen. Also, the media is propagating what is probably the biggest myth in U.S. politics. So much to get to today. So let's jump right in here on They Stand Corrected. Hello and welcome. It is awesome to have you here. My name is Josh Lebs, and this is my podcast, They Stand Corrected, which fact checks the news and digs into the systemic problems that are preventing the media from getting you the truth. This is something I'm really passionate about, as you might have picked up. I saw early on in my career in journalism how the news media not only lets people lie, but also lies in reporting. That was why I pushed hard inside CNN to create a position for myself as on-air fact checker. And throughout that time, I saw how much reporting would not make it through basic fact checking. This show is the best way to make a difference. The more news executives realize that people like you are paying attention to their failures and their systemic problems, the more those news executives will feel the need to do something about it. The only thing that works is what I'm doing here. I know this from the inside. This show is able to exist because of folks like you, so thank you for anything and everything you're doing to spread the word, to rate and review on podcast platforms. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, it means the world. If you take literally 1 minute, probably less, and put in a great review on Apple Podcasts and give it 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or whatever other app you're using. That's how the algorithms know to get people to listen. The people who are doing the most to make this possible are supporting the show, especially by becoming paid subscribers to my newsletter. I have promised that I will share messages from new paid subscribers. So let me get to one right now. Let's see. This one comes from Adam, who writes, "You are the only person in the media thinking critically and using facts." I did not read this in advance. Oh, man. You are concise, professional, and persuasive while providing sources. And he said he feels so disillusioned and frightened right now that so few people can see reality. I hear you, and thank you for the kudos. And folks, don't worry, I'm not taking that part literally, but it means a lot. Adam and everyone who's becoming a paid subscriber to the newsletter, thank you. Just so everyone knows, there is a free version of the newsletter. Anyone can get it, and I encourage you to sign up. It's on something called Substack. You can find the link in the show notes or at my website, joshlevs.com, JOSHLEVS.com. I don't expect you or anyone to take my word for anything. So I post lots of links and more information in the newsletter for anyone who wants to see it. There's also visual content. I put in images and videos and more. Paid subscribers, though, get exclusive additional content, a lot of it, including now transcripts of sections of these episodes that I have annotated and hyperlinked. Plus, my paid subscribers have access to something I put out about how to access news articles in virtually any major news publication without paywalls for free, legally, which means you will most likely save a ton of money. You might want to take a look at your credit card or bank statement sometime and see how much you're still paying every month in subscriptions to news agencies that are failing you. All right, lots to talk about today. First, this. I recently did another column for something called The Contrarian, which you will see inside my newsletter. I looked at how the media is propagating what is probably the biggest myth in U.S. politics. Here's what happened. Trump completed his first 100 days back in the White House. Both NBC and ABC went and interviewed him. And throughout those interviews, he, of course, said all kinds of things that are straight up false. We're used to this at this point. But there is something that you should know about. So here is a clip of Trump speaking with NBC about how much money he claims the United States was losing to China under Biden due to a trade deficit.
We lost $5 to $6 billion a day with Biden. $5 to $6 billion.
No, we didn't. But NBC, of course, did not say that in the interview or when they broadcast the pre-taped interview. Of course not. Instead, we got hard-hitting stuff like this.
When does it become the Trump economy?
It partially is right now. And I really mean this. I think the good parts are the Trump economy and the bad parts are the Biden economy.
Of course he really means that. At least NBC put up fact-checking piece on their website. I did not see a similar one on ABC's website. You might think I'd be psyched that, hey, at least NBC did that, but not really, because what difference did it make? Make some noise right now if you think that millions of viewers who watch Meet the Press go looking to the NBC website in the days afterwards for fact checks. Crickets. In my piece, I explained the reality there. First of all, the trade deficit was nowhere near that big. Also, trade deficit has nothing to do with making or losing money because it's the difference between exports and imports, and either side of that can lead to more or less money coming in. Anyway, the bigger point, I explained that the media propagates the whole concept of the GOP as being more fiscally responsible because they let these folks lie about the economy all the time. Facts exist. Republican presidents have created more debt than Democratic presidents. That's not me trashing or praising a party. Also, Democratic presidents have, in the words that politicians use, created far more jobs. Now, the real picture of jobs involves all kinds of things in the private sector that the government is not responsible for. But government policies do make a difference. And under Democratic presidents, job growth has been better. Again, this is not a partisan thing to say. It's literally just the numbers. As you know, I'm not rah-rah any party, just like an American plurality. I am independent, but that's irrelevant. I call out lies from everyone. These are just basics that viewers should be told and that the president should be asked about when he says stuff like this. All right, meanwhile, something else to catch you up on. Last week, I talked about grandstanding at the White House Correspondents Association dinner. If you missed that episode, I encourage you to go back and hear it. You'll hear people make these statements about how wonderfully their news agencies are doing in the fight to tell the truth, and I contrasted that against what their news agencies are actually doing. Well, there is an even bigger act of grandstanding in the media for me to tell you about now. 60 Minutes announced that its executive producer, Bill Owens, stepped down. And it sounds like he may have had good reason. Here is what host Scott Pelley said on the show.
He did it for us and you. Stories we pursued for 57 years are often controversial. Lately, the Israel-Gaza war and the Trump administration. Bill made sure they were accurate and fair. He was tough that way. But our parent company, Paramount, is trying to complete a merger. The Trump administration must approve it. Paramount began to supervise our content in new ways. None of our stories has been blocked, but Bill felt he lost the independence that honest journalism requires.
That move has been getting tons of praise from other folks in the media. They're saying how brave it was, how important it was that 60 Minutes spoke up against CBS's corporate owners in this way. I have talked about this. Journalists need to stand up against corporate owners when they get in the way of journalism. The Washington Post needs to do that with Jeff Bezos. The LA Times needs to do that with Patrick Soon-Shiong, their owner. I discussed this in previous episodes. These billionaires have been getting in the way of journalistic decision-making. But what you just heard from 60 Minutes is also grandstanding because 60 Minutes does not do what Scott Pelley said there. They're not accurate or fair. Just a couple weeks ago, I did an episode. I interviewed David Collier. He's an independent journalist in the UK. He fact-checked 60 Minutes on their coverage of a leader of the anti-Semitic mobs at Columbia University named Mohsen Madawi. CBS had not done extremely basic fact-checking. Literally, if they had just looked at dates for a few things, they would have seen that this guy, Mohsen Madawi, was spinning a tale that makes no sense, that was impossible. But it gets worse at 60 Minutes. Note that Scott Pelley specifically cited, of course, the Israel-Gaza war. The media covers that obsessively and disastrously, treating Hamas claims as fact and ignoring statements from Israel all the time that include actual data and scientific analyses. Well, earlier this year, 60 Minutes did one report in particular that was an epic failure, starting with this.
In a study published late this past week, the medical journal The Lancet said the death toll in Gaza has likely surpassed 70,000 people.
That is way more than even Hamas is claiming. I looked at that so-called study, as I have with previous studies. That study does not even mention that the information they're using comes from Hamas, a terrorist organization. These groups kept using the term Ministry of Health, never once acknowledging that that is Hamas. 60 Minutes totally ignored that even Hamas is not claiming a toll that high. And the show ignored detailed analyses that actually make sense, that show that those numbers are most likely inflated and include natural deaths. People die every day, having nothing to do with war. And the show did not mention that Hamas itself dramatically lowered the alleged number of women and children killed by thousands and thousands. I've dealt with this on the show. So at the top of this report, 60 Minutes established its bias. Truth equals facts plus context. They denied you both. And there's more. This piece on 60 Minutes largely revolved around what they called former State Department officials who resigned over Gaza. It's a small number from a huge government department. And there are always some radicalized people and misguided people in any agency. They interviewed this one former State Department employee, Josh Paul, who is a shame to Joshes everywhere. Here's a little piece of what he said.
October 7th was a moment of incredible worldwide solidarity with Israel. And had Israel leveraged that moment to press for a real, just, and lasting peace, I think we would be in a very different place now, in which Israel would not be facing this increasing isolation around the world, and in which its hostages would be free.
Unreal. Literally. That is called revisionist history. It's like the people who say January 6, 2021 was just a day of patriotic Americans taking a tour of their capital. There's no subjectivity here. It's not what happened. In the wake of October 7th, all over the world, there were people celebrating Hamas and the attacks. Incredible worldwide solidarity. What is he even talking about? There were statements from some countries, which were nice. Some of them were just performative, and they quickly went silent afterward when the critics started. Other countries immediately praised Hamas. In this country, leaders of student groups celebrated the massacres of Israelis, the slaughter, mass rapes, all of it. I discussed this in episode 7, what a bunch of countries did. 60 Minutes did not tell you any of that. And the bigger point is crazy, that after the worst, most evil terrorist attack of modern times, any country would say, oh, okay, now we're going to make concessions and have peace. That is so clueless. No one does that. Anyone working in the State Department should know that. The only way to protect a democracy is to fight back with a military that is ultimately under civilian control. Did the U.S. say after 9/11, hey, let's give the Taliban what they're looking for? If you've not heard episode 1 of this show, I encourage you to hear that, because the Taliban, just like Hamas, claimed that they were fighting against occupation, and they were also wrong. What Josh Paul was saying is also not how the Middle East works in particular. The only language that works, that gets through, is strength. That's it. Of course, Hamas has to be destroyed. And to blame Israel for the fact that Hamas is still holding hostages, everything about that is bonkers. But there's more. There's a great group called Honest Reporting that tracks coverage of Israel. Here's something they pointed out about Josh Paul.
CBS framed him as a neutral source, but he resigned from the State Department just 10 days after October 7th. Considering Israel is way past day 450 of their war against Hamas, and Josh Paul hasn't been part of the State Department's operations for basically the entire war, he should have never been platformed as a source of authority. Now he works for Dawn, an anti-Israel group that opposes the Abraham Peace Accords and promotes boycotting Israel.
None of that was in the report. The list of journalistic fiascos here just keeps going. At one point in this report, they said President Biden had accused Israel of indiscriminate bombing. They did not say that the White House walked that back. It had been some off-the-cuff moment. Who knows if Biden even knew what he was saying at that point. The White House said that was not a U.S. determination. If the president said something and then the White House walked it back, you tell the audience both. Obviously. Journalists are heaping praise on 60 Minutes for standing up to pressure from corporate parents at Paramount. But 60 Minutes does not do what it claimed. We can and should expect both. Stand up to the Trump administration and stand up to the big lie of the left, this mythology of a big bad Israel. And here's the irony. I told you previously about how CBS News punished its own anchor for attempting to do actual journalism. There's this hate monger who wrote a book filled with lies. His name is Ta-Nehisi Coates. The media worships him. Anyway, finally, one person in the news media attempted to ask him actual questions about basic context he left out. That was an anchor on CBS's morning news show. CBS punished him for doing that. And then, according to reports, a top Paramount official backed him up. So, not only is CBS News a mess, but in that case, it was a corporate executive who apparently tried to do the right thing journalistically. That is how twisted this has gotten. Media, if you genuinely want news reporting to be accurate and fair, then call out the failures of a news network or show always. Don't ignore those failures when you like them, when they boost your preconceived false notions. It leaves you with no moral voice when you speak up in support of a news show later on. Coming up, a practical, simple, and pathetic reason that news agencies punish democracies. We'll take a trip to, well, you'll hear. You know how sometimes you're out in a public place and there's a performer on the sidewalk? Maybe they're playing the saxophone, or some kind of folk music. And they've got an instrument case open. People are tossing in bills. Well, if you're like me, if you stop and listen, then you'll probably toss something in there. If you listen for a while, like 5 minutes or even like 10 minutes, then you'll be even more likely to want to give something. Imagine standing there listening for hours and hours. You would definitely toss something in, right? Making this podcast is kind of like that. This show has now provided more than 25 hours of content. And unlike in those examples, it's expensive to put together. There's a long list of stuff it takes to make every episode. So I count on you. I know that not everyone wants to sign up for an email newsletter, so there's another way you can support this show. It's really simple. A virtual tip jar, a site on PayPal for you to just type in any figure you want to toss in. I see every contribution, and I get in touch with every person who includes a form of contact, like an email address. You can contribute a little or a lot, whatever works, to help They Stand Corrected continue to exist. And maybe also to help cover these expenses for people out there who don't have any cash to toss in, who are just getting by with the basics in their lives, but count on this show. Every contribution means more than you know. The site is paypal.me/Josh Lebs. You'll find a link to it in the show notes or at my website, joshlebs.com, JOSHLEVS.com. Just click where it says donate to keep the facts coming. Thank you. I want to take you on a mental journey to another part of the world, because when we only hear about an area in the context of something tragic, we can lose sight of its three-dimensional reality. So, wherever you are now, imagine looking at your city or town from above and then zooming out so you see the wider area, and then zooming out so it's like you're seeing where it is on Earth. Then zoom over to Africa, unless you're currently in Africa, in which case you don't need to zoom over. All right, but now you're looking at Africa, south of the nations at the top that are considered part of MENA, the Middle East and North Africa. South of that, pretty much smack in the middle, is the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we're going to zoom into an area in the northeast of the country called North Kivu. That's the province. And then into a town called Lubero. I looked up the topography. This area has these beautiful, tall mountains reaching more than 8,000 feet, and there are forested basins, diverse terrain. Just like everywhere, there are lots of animals, too. There are species like forest elephants, gorillas, chimpanzees, antelope, lots of bird species. Side note, I remember when I was in Australia and looking up at the sky, I kept thinking, I didn't know birds like this exist. Anyway, let's stay focused on Democratic Republic of Congo. Big country with more than 100 million people. And in this area, Lubero, about 1.7 million people living their lives. Okay, here goes. There are horrific things happening in this area and throughout a huge stretch of Africa that don't make the news in big mainstream media, particularly slaughter of Christians by Islamist terrorists. I discussed this phenomenon in an episode in December. But since then, there have been all these new attacks. In one incident, according to a bunch of reports, Islamist terrorists marched 70 people into a church, slaughtered them, and beheaded at least some of them. Vatican News reports that it was apparently a massacre intended to instill fear and exert control over the local population. This keeps happening. If you search for information about it, you won't find it in almost any big mainstream media. You will find it discussed on CBN, the Christian Broadcasting Network. Here was a guest they had on, Dexter Van Zyl, managing editor of the Middle East Forum.
The violence like this against Christians perpetrated by jihadists is not a new problem. It's been a problem in North Africa for a long time. Trying to get people to pay attention to it is very difficult.
The host, Raj Nair, discussed this with him.
If you were to replace 70 Congolese Christian with 70 Palestinians were beheaded, 70 people at a pride parade were beheaded, this would be the biggest news story of the decade. And yet this just happened and no one's reporting on it. And literally crickets.
Right. And it's like that with Boko Haram when they murder people in Nigeria. Okay. If the IDF were responsible for these beheadings, it would have made the front page of the Washington Post and the New York Times and every newspaper throughout the world. And there would be, Israeli Jews condemning it as well.
Of course. So why aren't we hearing about it? Well, there's the obvious bigotry and obsession with anti-Semitic big bad Israel narratives. But there's also something very pragmatic. This is where we get into how the media punishes places for being democracies. Listen to this from Dexter.
There's just not that many reporters on the ground. The Congo is a huge, dangerous place to be a reporter. It's kind of desolate. If you go there, there's a very good chance you're going to get very sick and you may not get good medical care. Go to Israel. You can have a nice meal at a restaurant in Jerusalem after you've covered a protest at the security barrier.
In modern democracies, you have protections and comforts. Look what the media does. It takes advantage of that. It is so much easier to send people to a democracy like Israel, where they're comfortable and have all this modernity. So they go there and obsess over everything that ever happens and things that don't happen, but just people make accusations that something happened, and they rush to report that. Which brings us back to these beheadings in Lubero. Technically, I can't tell you exactly what happened. Christian organizations have looked into it and said they're definite that this happened. Snopes had a piece about how they can't be sure, and that gets right at the crux of it. Why can't I, or Snopes, or anyone else be sure? Because news agencies don't go there. The moral of the story for nations everywhere is, if you go democratic and modern, then reporters will come and make you look terrible to the entire world. But if you avoid democracy and crucial aspects of modernity, then journalists won't want to be there, and the world won't pay attention to what you're doing. This is not an opinion. It's a fact. In this way, the media is punishing democracies and giving nations a big incentive to not be democracies. I should also tell you about Nigeria, to the west of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Vatican News reports that more than 52,000 Christians have been slaughtered by Islamist terrorists in just that country alone. This has been going on for years. CBN recently interviewed a local journalist in Nigeria, Mike Oded James, who described just some of what these terrorists are doing.
They come to the houses of people, they shoot the father, and then they'll grab the children. They leave the mother, and then after 2-3 days, they'll send a text message or a cell message to the mother and say, we're asking for a ransom of 100 million. If you cannot pay, we will execute them one by one. Some of these girls are raped. The men are brutalized. They are beaten. They are chained hands to leg.
None of this is getting the glare of big media. Here's someone who talked about it eloquently.
What is truly shocking is that no one in the world seems to care. Where is the outcry? Where are the headlines? Where's the media, the governments, the religious leaders?
This is ironic. The speaker here is the chief rabbi of South Africa. When I went looking for videos about this problem in Africa, instead of reports from major news agencies, what came up instead were CBN and this man, Warren Goldstein.
The extent of the threat is massive. Security researchers have described the continent as an emerging global epicenter of terrorism. The European Union Institute for Security Studies has estimated that more than half of all conflict violence targeting civilians in Africa arises from Salafi jihadist terror groups.
You know what that sounded a lot like? A news report. Non-journalists are stepping up where the media is failing, and the slaughters continue while the media looks away. I'll be right back.
And now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Josh Leves.
We are blessed to be able to have a speaker this evening who speaks with a lot of heart.
An outstanding author, a principled and groundbreaking journalist, a really engaging speaker and thinker.
Broadcaster, journalist, and host of They Stand Corrected, the podcast fact-checking the news. Thank goodness.
Josh spent 20 years reporting for NPR and CNN, where he developed unique expertise on nonpartisan fact-checking. He has been called Truth Seeker in Chief.
Josh has won multiple Peabody Awards, Murrow Awards,
and awards from the AP, from the Society of Professional Journalists, the National Association of Black Journalists, and more.
His book, All In, was published by HarperCollins and won the Nautilus Gold Award for promoting positive social change. He has spoken to the United Nations, Congress, Google.
And of course, I think is very cool, won a debate at Oxford.
He launched his podcast and newsletter called They Stand Corrected to provide listeners with the truth in a world of disinformation.
Clearly, he is a much-needed voice during these crazy times.
It's my pleasure to introduce Josh Leves to you today.
Please welcome.
Please join me in welcoming Josh Leves.
I love getting out there and meeting people like you. It's such a great opportunity to answer your questions and discover more about listeners to this show and potential listeners too. If you're interested in working out something in person or online, there's a form at my website, joshlevs.com. That's JOSHLEVS.com. You'll find a link in the show notes. Just click bookings. As I record this, Trump is taking off on a trip to the Middle East. Oy, I'm sure there will be no disasters or blunders there. 2 notes on this. First, he is trying to defend his willingness to accept a massive gift from Qatar in the form of a plane. He says it would be used for government purposes. The media is all over this and quoting people about it being so corrupt, which is legit. But all that coverage in the media is also hypocritical because the mainstream media itself has been giving Qatar a massive gift for years and years by whitewashing Al Jazeera. Learn all about that in episode 11. Here's a clip.
In keeping with the media's own rules, every story about Al Jazeera should include an acknowledgement that it is owned by the government of Qatar. a government that's also incredibly repressive in other ways, by the way, against women, against LGBTQ plus people. There are horrific reports of what people undergo in Qatar. And yet, Al Jazeera has still gotten this image to many Americans of being progressive. And it takes advantage of the fact that most Americans don't speak Arabic. Al Jazeera itself, in Arabic, celebrates acts of terror and cheers them on.
In there, you'll also hear about hypocrisy on this issue from NPR, plus this thing involving Elon Musk. It's all in there. I also explain how Qatar used its money to get the media to do that by hiring U.S. journalists, tossing money at them. Qatar has been doing the same thing with universities, radicalizing students. The media gives that very little attention, if any. Offering Trump a plane is just more of Qatar using its money from hydrocarbons to push its anti-democratic Islamist agenda. Qatar, a country where Hamas leaders have spent years living in luxury as billionaires. Also, as Trump heads to the Middle East, I want you to understand the lay of the land. The best analysis I have heard of what's really been going on in the Middle East in recent years came from Egyptian political analyst Hassam Hassanein of the peace startup Sharaka. He joined me in episode 34. Find the link to that in the newsletter or show notes, or just scroll back in your feeds to episode 34. Part of what he talks about in there is the new evil axis led by Iran. And speaking of Iran, before we go, a quick ask of you. There is a new petition out about something that Biden and Trump agree on, that both parties overwhelmingly agree on, that Iran must not get nuclear weapons. I can't overestimate how awful it would be if Iran got to that point. It would be a seismic change in the world. Iran is the chief international sponsor of terrorism, Islamist terrorism. This petition is only 4 sentences long. It takes just seconds to read and sign it. I only ask you to sign petitions that I sign, and I have signed this one. If you sign this by May 16th, then you will be helping to support They Stand Corrected, thanks to a sponsored partnership. In order for your signature to count, you need to use my unique link, which you will find in the show notes or at my newsletter. As always, I want to hear from you. Be in touch through the newsletter or the form at my website. You determine so much of what I talk about. Thank you so much for listening. I will see you next week.